So, despite an attempt on the president's life, Donald Trump has sought to keep his lead alive by nominating J.D. Vance of Ohio Senate fame to the vice presidential ticket. Now, granted, let's talk about this with the latest polls in mind. Who is likely to win the 2024 election and by how much in each state going forward? So the question at hand here is, how does Donald Trump's lead get affected by J.D. Vance, who is a person who has less than 2 years in the Senate, but is also a firebrand for conservative values, somebody who a lot of people see as to the right and more hardcore conservative than even a Donald Trump himself. The question might be, would that hurt Donald Trump, or does that fire up the base to a point to where it overcomes that difference? Just to bring a snapshot into the polling, we do know that Donald Trump is leading the popular vote in a 1v1 by 2.5 percentage points. Granted, a lot of these polls are done before Trump actually picked J.D. Vance to be the nominee. And so from that standpoint, we're not all the way sure how this is going to affect it. Obviously, I have a lot of expertise as to getting to the polls before the normal people get it. But the point being is that Emerson, for example, has a one-off of a sample size that is actually pretty enormous when you look at it. You have a 2,000 sized poll. Now, this is bigger than most people's. In fact, we have Donald Trump leading by 4 as of that nomination of J.D. Vance. But let's look into the other factors. So obviously, this is the first time in over 100 years where we have 2 of the same candidates from the last election running again. And so we can actually look to 2016 and see how that VP selection affected that presidential race. So as we can see here, Mike Pence was selected on July 15th. Okay, so basically the same day that JD got picked. Now, if we look into the polling of that era, we'll notice that Hillary on this day 8 years ago was winning by 3.2 percentage points. Hillary ended up winning the popular vote by over 2 percentage points, about 2.1. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you compare when Trump picked Pence, Trump actually went up by over a percentage point in the popular vote. That 1 percentage point made the difference in the Electoral College. So Clinton still won the popular vote, but it didn't matter, obviously, when it comes to being president. And so Donald Trump might see his polling lead go from 2.5 to, let's say, 3.6 if you apply the same math. The next question you might have for me today is, well, how is Mike Pence a different pick from Donald Trump? Well, there's 2 different factors here. Number one, you have to understand that in 2016, for the most part, like I'd say at least 90% of the time, Donald Trump was definitely the statistical underdog when it came to polling, when it came to ascertaining who was in the lead. Hillary had him beat usually and had a fundraising advantage of at least 3-1, if not 6-1 in different points of the campaign. That being said, Mike Pence was a reassurance after, the whole primary. That was a disaster for the establishment Republicans, the toppling of the Bush dynasty and the forthcoming Clinton apocalypse. We saw that those dynasties were really seeking a person in the VP slot for Donald that would have been seen as like a safer option, just to say like, okay, well, maybe Donald Trump is crazy. And so who can temper people's, aspirations there. And basically what happened is that Donald Trump, as a conciliatory pick to the evangelical crowd, the pro-life crowd, the normal Ted Cruz kind of conservatives, he picked Mike Pence of Indiana. Now, this is different than where he could have gone elsewhere. He could have gone Chris Christie. He could have gone Newt Gingrich. But the point being is that Pence served as kind of like a numbing agent, kind of like if you put ice in a vodka shot or something, it's just kind of to ease it off, not to ruin the essence of the drink, but to kind of, put it on the rock, so to speak. Now, JD is a totally different animal. So as you guys know, JD is known for being this new crop of Republican that is super far right. Now, I don't really believe that, but the point being is that he's definitely in the vein of that Project 2025 kind of like new American opportunity to kind of seize the old country back, so to speak. And so he is different from Mike Pence, who was definitely, let's say, socially conservative, anti-gay, whatever they would call him back then, electric fence Pence, they would call him. But the point being is that he was still kind of a Bushite. Okay, so back then they would have been more strict on the social issues, I grant you that. But when it came to immigration and this stuff, they kind of were toting the line and basically carrying water for the establishment. And that was that sort of a pick. Now, JD is a different crop. Like I said, he's a populist. He was elected not even 2 years ago in the state of Ohio. And we're going to get into the facts of that race. But just let me get started with, obviously, JD as a different candidate to Trump. Okay, first of all, when it came to Mike Pence, he wasn't picked as a youth candidate. Donald Trump didn't really get hit on his age 8 years ago. 8 years ago, Donald Trump, I believe, was 69 years old, and he was young enough to get away with just being an adult. Nobody said, oh, this guy's so old. Nobody complained. Even with Hillary, they said, oh, she's, 68. Okay, who cares? Now, looking onto the map, we know that JD is a different specimen. JD is looking at the whole country, and his pick is substantively different than the Pence one. I'll tell you why. When it comes down to it, J.D. Vance is 39 years old, I believe. Okay, so he could still be my dad. I'm that young, but the point being is that he is pretty young when it comes to this ticket. Let's look at the ages of the contestants in this race. Joe Biden is 81, turning 82 in November. We have Donald Trump, who is, I think, 78, and we have Harris, who is 60 years old, I think. So nobody's really young. Harris obviously doesn't have the elderly issues, obviously, so that's not an issue, but she's definitely not like bleeding edge young or anything. That being said, of course, the way I'd look at it is that 40-year-old Vance is definitely notably younger than everybody running. Even if Kamala were to be the nominee, that would still be something that is noticeable and palpable. That being said, Donald Trump is looking to assuage age fears. Looking at polling, about 75 to 80 or so percent of Americans think that Joe Biden's too old to be the president, kind of correlative, obviously, with dementia. Donald Trump, on the other hand, he's only 3.5 years younger. It's not a world of a difference. But what is the difference is the salinity therein. Okay, so it's not so much like, oh, Biden's old. It's just that he is mentally not there. You know, somebody who's even older than Joe, like Alan Dershowitz, is completely sharp and he's fine. That being said, obviously, we do have Donald Trump with about, I think, 27% of Americans think that he's too old to be president. Now, that's not a deal breaker for obviously the vast majority of people, but it's definitely not a help. And if Donald were, let's say, 10 years younger, that would objectively be better electorally. Just obviously, duh. Now, JD is kind of insurance for that. JD is somebody who is certainly younger. He's 40 years old, younger than Obama when he ran for president, by the way. And look, he is an articulate white dude. He's pretty normal looking. He's basically kind of like Pence insofar as he's kind of like more normal than Trump, but he's certainly more right wing relative to the Overton window nowadays as compared to where Pence was 8 years ago. So keep this in mind. So that's what changes the perception of, let's say, Pence pick versus a Vance pick. Just to give you the 10-second summary, Pence was a reassuring sort of like, okay, look, Republicans, this is the normal. This is like, look, nothing, I'm not going to rock the boat too much. That's Donald Trump speaking, okay, paraphrasing him. Now, Vance, that 10-second pitch goes to, you know what, I am 78 years old. I will be 83 in 4.5 years. How about I pick a guy who's going to be in his mid-40s by then, and maybe he'll be the heir to the throne going forward, okay? That's the Trump sell. The first poll that has been publicly available to the internet is one that The Hill covers here about Vice President Vance and his perspectives as a nominee. Again, this is the most preliminary sort of thing you can find, but basically the day after Trump had tweeted ostensibly that Vance was the pick, there was a survey conducted, and it said that about 27% of Americans said that the Ohio Republican was the best or a good option for Trump. Now, that might look really dire, and there's a lot of people on Twitter that are saying that exact same line, but the truth is that it's not a conclusive study. Now, looking at the survey, of course, a plurality of respondents, about 37% of which say that they are not sure if he's even a good choice, while 16% say the decision is neither good nor bad, says the polls. So this is a complicating factor, okay? Here's one thing. 37% saying not sure is basically a nothing burger. These people are probably the type that don't even know who JD Vance is, or probably just vaguely know of their existence. For instance, if I were to bring up the name Mike Braun, if I were to bring up the name James Lankford, you know, people that have been in the Senate in recent years, people might know the name because we're all nerds here watching, I assume, like the video if you're a nerd too. But in politics, it's not like you viscerally even care, okay? So anyhow, we move on to the next number, which says that 16% say that it's not a good or bad. That is a combination of people like the 37% prior that said basically like, okay, well, I don't even know who this is, or I'm not really sure. Now, that doesn't matter. That 16% is not a negative either. JD has plenty of opportunity and runway in the next several months to provide speeches, campaign rallies, and people will like him. Because if you're neutral over somebody being a senator on paper, there's virtually no way that him giving speeches would make him any more hated than he is now. You know what I mean? Like if I don't know who a senator is and I watch him, I'll probably start to like him because most people respect a politician in that level. And when it comes down to them not being agnostic on JD, that's also not a bad thing because, again, Trump is winning this election right now. Therefore, for a neutral to be added to the ticket, it actually does not hurt Trump, obviously. Okay, furthermore, of those people with a positive opinion of Trump's choice, it was 12% that say that Vance was the best one. 15% say that Vance is a good pick, but not the best. Of those several people that he mentioned, again, Burgum, Rubio, Vivek, whatever have you. Moving on the other side, about 20% of respondents view this election in a negative light. In fact, they say that 11% conjecture that Vance is a bad pick, but not the worst possible pick, and 9% say that the first-term senator is the worst pick that he could have possibly made. So that's about 20% outright negative. Now, let me tell you what. That 11% are people that probably wanted Vivek, they probably wanted Burgum, they wanted Rubio, and they said, you know what, this is bad because I would have preferred somebody else, like a Glenn Youngkin. But they're still going to be Republican voters at the end of the day. 9% say that it's the worst. Even that 9% of people that are already voting for Trump obviously aren't all going to change their mind. Maybe 2 of the 9% will. Anyhow, the point being is that it's actually a good result. This, again, very preliminary, very little time put into this. But the point being is that there's a negative 20% hard anti-Vance resentment here. And there's a strong positive 27 for Vance. And obviously the rest are agnostic / don't really know who he is. And that's usually a good thing for young guys because obviously you can prove yourself with time. And so with that being said, this is actually a pretty good result. The next step in deciphering what's happening in this election is to understand how Vance in the macro scale affects the election. Like I said, the pick of Vance addresses the age issue when it came to the race, so that's assuaged. That helps Donald Trump, actually. What might hurt Donald Trump, obviously, though, is the suburbs. Maybe is Vance seen to the right of Trump? Is the guy too conservative for middle-class Americans that voted for Trump in 2016 but voted for Biden in 2020? And mind you, the name of the game for winning re-election for Donald is going to be to get that voter back. Not some random person in the ghetto or any person in a farm. It's to say, who are those 2016 voters for Trump that went to Biden in 2020? We're talking about the people in the outside periphery of Atlanta, the people in Michigan, Okemos, Bloomfield, all these places outside of Detroit, the suburban areas, the exurbs, the people in Philadelphia, the people outside of it even, the Bucks counties of the world, okay? This is what we're trying to win back if you're Donald Trump. So how do you get those people back? And you might say, well, you know what? JD Vance is bad for the white college educated people that went to Biden last election. But I'm here to give you a point to the opposite. First, we must study the 2022 election in Ohio for Senate. This is the only election we have to base off my opinion, and so that's what we're going to work with. As you guys can see, though, we have Tim Ryan, who was a congressman, I believe. He ran for president and got smashed and destroyed and quashed by a combo of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bloomberg of all people, Amy Klobuchar, all these types, Joe Biden, namely. Anyhow, so Tim Ryan was actually, believe it or not, a pretty good politician for the time. He came off as a moderate Democrat, which is a good thing in Ohio, obviously nowadays. And 2, he had a funding advantage. And you might say, a funding advantage by a Democrat? Oh, well, you're coloring me shocked, but it's true. I don't know if some people didn't know this. And like the video if this is something you learned, but Democrats, by and large, outspend Republicans every election for the past several years. As of Trump, as if I've been a teenager that I've been following this, the Democrats have outspent Republicans in virtually every race outside of obviously like Nebraska maybe. But anyhow, you look at this and JD Vance won Ohio against Tim Ryan by 6 percentage points. Now, Trump won the state both times by I think over 8%, but there's a difference here. A lot of lay people may say, well, how does JD Vance underperform Trump in 2022, which was a red, not a red wave. We all saw what happened. But the point being is like it was definitely a more Republican favorable map than the usual, more than 2020. So then how the hell did Trump do better than Vance? But I'll explain why. So I'm going to mathematically prove that Ohio and the 6% win is actually kind of impressive when you look at the bones of it. Now, as we know, the spending in 2020 was obviously more Democrat than it was Republican at the national level. But when it came down to a Republican state such as Ohio, you saw that actually Republicans outspent the Democrats. They had about 54% of the donations, whereas the Democrats had about 43% of the donations. So the Democrats were outspent by about maybe 10 to 12 percentage points in Ohio, and Trump won it by a lot. But when you look at the Vance-Ryan race in 2022, you notice a big difference. In fact, when you look at it, the Open Secrets website shows the truth. And apparently, JD Vance spent about $14 million for the Senate, whereas Tim Ryan won by $56 million and spent it, sorry. And so basically, JD Vance was outspent by Tim Ryan 4-1. So think about it. Tim Ryan spent 4 times as much money in the state of Ohio for Senate than did JD Vance, and JD still won by 6. So that explains why he underperformed. And people might say, well, other Republicans statewide did better than JD. But you see, the thing is that those elections weren't really nationalized. If you looked up the news and the spending on that on that state overall, Ohio, that is, it was basically all dominated by the Vance-Ryan whole debacle, and it's not over other issues. And so you could see maybe some attorney general did better, but that's obviously a different animal. Another thing that people must understand is that mathematically, obviously, not only did JD kind of do well given the funding difference, but even beyond that, we have to also understand that in 2024, the funding advantage for the Democrats will not be 4-1 as compared to in the Senate, obviously in Ohio a few years ago. And so the actual fundraising month to month has been favoring Republicans. Obviously, this is due to some miraculous events. Obviously, President Trump just survived an assassination, got convicted, all within the span of several weeks. And so that fundraising advantage might narrow in. But the point being is that the funding is a lot more level and based in equality numerically than was 2016 or 20 or even 12 or 2008. So anyhow, now we look into the Donald Trump election in 2020. You'll notice that again he did better, but also notice the voting difference. The turnout was much different. In fact, Trump got 3.1 million votes, but if you look at the Senate level here, JD only got 2.2. That's a 16% difference in the turnout from the prior election. And so turnouts in the midterm is way lower, as we all know. And the thing is that the people that do turn out in midterms are more so college educated white people. And over time, colleges have become more female. And so obviously, if the majority of the college educated white people are females, then that's going to be more Democrat than usual. And so, in fact, in the presidential election years, there's a ton of working class white people that are known as low propensity voters. But, in midterms, it's a lot more suburban wine moms and college educated people that are feminists and whatever have you. And so it's a disadvantageous result for Republicans, obviously, because there's a lot of secret Trump voters that only come out when he's on the ballot. And so when it's just JD on his own, it's not the best. Now, lucky for him, in 2024, Donald Trump will be on the head of the ballot. And so that won't be an issue at all. In fact, JD outperformed Trump when it came to the suburban people, likely because he's probably more palatable, just obviously because he's like a younger, more articulate, kind of less bombastic figure, no matter what his policies are. And so, in fact, when you actually try to sell JD to some middle-aged, wine mom that might think that Trump did a coup or whatever, I think that they might actually be more amenable to a person like a JD Vance or a Josh Hawley, not because they're even more liberal than Trump, but just because they just come off less offensive, and that's just the way it is. But anyway, with that exposition out of the way, like the video if you want to see the meat of the content. So going state by state, starting with the state of Arizona, we have Donald Trump winning by about 6 percentage points over Joe Biden. If you make that a five-way race, it gets even worse for the incumbent president. In fact, you look at Trump winning by over 7 in that circumstance, okay? Now, all the people that you see in the poll actually made the ballot as of recently in Arizona, so that's even better. And so Trump will certainly win Arizona with JD Vance on the ballot, no matter what. Now we move on to the next state. Another strong showing for the Trump-Vance ticket. We see that Trump is leading right now by 5. And again, this is prior to a lot of the post-assassination polling, which has recently seen pretty good for Donald Trump insofar as electability is concerned. And so I think Nevada is also going red. We move on to Florida. We don't need to cover that, obviously, at this point. It's too obvious. But we do have some other states. Like Ohio, obviously, Vance might help slightly there, too. But it's not like it matters. North Carolina is so solidly Republican that at this point they might even take it out of the swing states because it is so likely to go for Trump. In fact, Biden, obviously, if he has any chance, won't even win North Carolina. He'll probably best be spending his money in the Rust Belt. But moving on to North Carolina, we do have Trump winning by 7 as of the most recent poll aggregation. And so you've got that right there. We're going to move on to the state of Georgia, too. This one's also in line with the other states. It's a strong Trump performance. Obviously, you have Kennedy at a 7, so that's not amazing. So Robert F.K. or whatever is not the best candidate right now, third-party-wise. He's been kind of atrophying as a candidate. Anyhow, Trump is winning by 4.4 in the most recent poll. We've got that there. We have another state such as, let's say, Pennsylvania. A lot of people would rightfully classify this one as the turning point state. This is definitely the keystone state in more ways than one. This is definitely the biggest electoral vote for a swing state, in my opinion. I mean, it depends on how you count them, but certainly 19 electoral votes is huge in 2024. And Trump is actually leading right now by 4.5, which is massive. And it's beyond the margin of error, too. Polls tend to be wrong, let's say by 2 to 3, either way. But when you're up by almost 5, then it kind of gets out of the consideration there. And so that being said, let's move on to Wisconsin, which is an enigma when it comes to polling, I tell you what, because Trump is winning by 3.4, which is pretty impressive. But in a lot of polls, for whatever reason, he does worse in Wisconsin than anywhere else, which is completely asinine, in my opinion. But moving on. See, for example, in Michigan, he's doing 2 points worse than in let's say, Wisconsin, which is somewhat tricky to understand. If you do a 5-way, let's see how that changes it. And Trump is doing even worse, so it's kind of odd, but he's still winning it regardless. It just is a little bit odd. The polling is always having like one little redheaded stepchild of a state to like completely bungle the results of. Minnesota has not been polled in about a month, but the most recent polls have Trump. If you were to just divide these up, I think in a five-way election, Trump is winning by one. Obviously, things are pointing towards things being better for Donald Trump as obviously that assassination attempt. And this was actually prior to even the debate debacle by Joe Biden. So obviously, he's likely to win Minnesota if that's the clip that we're going at. And so moving on to, I think the next state would be New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a tricky animal, obviously. It's a feisty one. So we have a poll right after that presidential debate by St. Alstom's College Survey, and it's a really big one, actually. You've got Trump winning by 2 with Kennedy on the ballot, too, at an undersampled 4%, which is actually pretty underwhelming for that guy. And so that being said, obviously, we do have Donald Trump winning New Hampshire as of right now, too. Now, moving on, I think we will do Virginia. So there's been a recent flurry of stuff right after the assassination attempt by the people investing in Virginia. And assuming Biden's the nominee, then we do have him even with Trump. Then we have another one with him leading by 1. Now, granted, I do think that over time, this is a really difficult sell here because obviously JD Vance is more conservative than you would like to win Virginia. In fact, had he picked Youngkin, then it'd be a sure thing, I think, for Donald. But anyhow, I just don't. It's a really hard thing to call here. But to seeing how prior to Vance he was winning by 2 or 3 in this Emerson poll makes me think that with Vance he probably win it by like less than 1%, but it's still a win. Now moving on to Nebraska's 2nd district. This one went about 7 points for Joe in 2020. Obviously, the popular vote ought to be 8 points different than it was last time. A 4.6 win might turn into a 3.5 for Donald now. Which would be, I think, an 8.1 difference. And so I think Trump might eke this one out, actually. Now, let's get into the next point. Now, the most recent polling is by a Democratic-funded pollster, a Global Strategy Group right here, of this poll. And Trump is apparently losing by 6 percentage points to Joe Biden. Again, this is prior to the debate and prior to the assassination attempt. So Trump might do 3 points better than usual, obviously because of those two main factors, but he's still losing it. And Colorado seems to be too far out. It might go back to where it was in 2016, where it was kind of close, and you might be tempted to put money in there if you're Trump and the Republicans. But seeing how Biden isn't really doing any spending there, it's pretty obvious that they don't really think it's an issue. And so we're going to move on to New Mexico then. So as we see here, we have Republican-funded polls that have Biden winning by 1 or 2 percentage points, depending on who you have on the ballot. That being said, it's a difficult thing. Because on one hand, obviously it's a Republican-funded pollster, so it's biased. But ever since that poll 3 weeks ago, we know that there's been a bad debate performance and this assassination attempt, which is a rally around the flag moment for the kind of incumbent president in Trump anyhow. So the point being is that I think this poll is actually indicative of what the real thing is. Because obviously Trump has gained a few points in the polls ever since that poll has been done. But obviously there's a bias here. So we can kind of call that a wash and then have Biden win the state of New Mexico just very barely. So it'd be like Virginia and New Mexico, which are probably the closest in polling. But anyhow, the last state we're going to cover is a combination of Maine, but also we have New Jersey. Maine is somewhat difficult to point to because in 2016 to 20, kind of like New Hampshire, it kind of all of a sudden went blue. That being said, it might do the same thing again, but in the reverse in 24. As of months ago, when Trump was kind of tied with Biden, you had Biden winning by 2, Trump winning by 1, even, Trump plus 1. So it's a flurry of different poll results that we can't really rely on, but it gives a heuristic that it was a dead heat as of 3 months ago. And obviously things are better for Donald Trump than they were 3 months ago, regardless of who the VP was going to be. And so therefore, I would say Maine at large would probably go to Trump in this case. Now, moving on to New Jersey as the final state. I think this is somewhat ironic, but we see the most recent pollster, Coefficient, which I haven't really heard of, had Trump beating Biden by 1 a couple weeks ago, which would indicate, just based off of the latest polls, obviously, I'm not saying this is my prediction, but we've had the shooting more recently too. And so, I mean, if we take this as gospel, which, screw it, why not? Then I think that New Jersey could go Republican. Now, obviously, there's not much to base that off of, as the polling has been pretty lacking outside of, obviously, the newfound success that Trump has had electorally. And so we could have New Jersey go blue. No, could it go red? See, the thing is that obviously, like, according to this poll, it would be pretty good for Trump. But is that a little bit, wish casting? Aren't you hoping on too much there? So just to be thorough, and like the video if you like this level of autism, but we do have some polling from Emerson, which I trust pretty well. We see that as of months ago that Biden was winning by 5 percentage points with Kennedy on the ballot. And the thing is with me is that obviously Trump is way better off than he was in March. And so I think that, but that logic being used, I think that Biden would probably win New Jersey just ever so slightly, maybe by like, let's say 1.5, and we're going to call it a day there. So Biden Harris, assuming that Biden's the candidate still, and that's, you just never know, but Biden Harris will end up with 196 electoral votes. Trump-Vance would end up in this scenario with 342, with the closest states being Virginia going Republican, New Mexico going Democrat slightly, Colorado getting feisty and close, and you've got New Jersey also super close. Maine is also troubling. Nebraska 2nd District is also suspicious. And I think New Hampshire would also be really close. But anyhow, that's 342 to 196. Comment down below what you thought about the video. And like it, because that's what matters the most to me. Okay, like the video, and I'll see y'all on the next one. Adios.